So in this lesson, we'll finish up our preliminary discussion of demand. Of course, we'll be referring back to it constantly throughout the rest of the course. But in this section, what we do is basically take everything we've learned so far in regards to demand schedules, changes in price, changes in demand, and we put it on paper, and we've actually have the chance now to really visualize and see what's really taking place as opposed to just discussing it. So the first thing we'll do is talk about the demand schedules, but as we do that, we want to review first and make sure that we've got everything understood. So we'll start with what is the law of demand. So remember with the law of demand that price and quantity demanded have an inverse relationship, meaning of course that as we look at the two, we can split them here. When prices fall, quantity demanded rises, and when prices rise, quantity demand falls. Making sure, of course, that we understand we're talking about quantity demanded, not the word demand, but quantity demanded, and then price. And so that's the law of demand. So we want to make sure we remember that. The second thing is, how does a change in demand differ from a change in quantity demanded? Well, you've got to remember that when we talk about changes in demand and changes in quantity demanded, we got to remember that price causes movements along the demand curve that we'll look at. So price causes movements. We know because we can see that right here. So this tells us for a fact that when the price changes, the quantity demand changes. So we see movements. Now, determinants of demand causes shifts, which means that, in other words, determinants cause shifts. So prices don't change. That is the key here. Prices don't change. Rather, the demand changes. So what are the types of determinants? Well, when we're talking about the demand schedules, these show the relationship between a list of quantities demanded at different prices. Our determinants are things like income, price of related goods, expectations, taste, size of the market. Those determinants will cause demand to shift to the left and to the right. So this is our demand schedule we're going to work with, noticing, of course, that we see the price of ice cream cones going up and the quantity of ice cream cones going down. Okay, so let's graph this demand schedule. So what we're noticing here is our demand schedule. I have it over here, our price of ice cream cones and our quantity. So let's put it on the graph. Notice that price is our vertical axis, quantity is our horizontal axis. This will always be the same. So we first go in, plot our points along our graph. And so we get our points and then we draw our line. So this is our demand schedule, and this is what it looks like. So this is the demand curve that represents the visual of our demand schedule. Now what we'll notice, of course, is as prices go down, so a decrease in price creates an increase of the quantity of cones demanded. So when prices go down, ice cream cones increase in quantity demanded. Very simple, that's the law of demand, and here we see that law of demand graphed visually, and that's what we want to focus on when we go throughout this lesson, is what does the demand curve look like and how is it going to move. So the first thing we're going to look at is this question of, is demand endless? And of course we answered that on our last lesson and we said no, and the reason why, of course, is because every consumer reaches a point of satisfaction. Therefore demand isn't endless, because at some point we all get to the point where we're like, okay, I don't want any more for now. Of course, different consumers have different points of satisfaction. And we use that term utility in economy because it describes the preferences of consumers and explains the quantity of goods that people choose to buy. So this tells us what we buy and how much. And that's that utility term. And when it comes to where we are satisfied, that utility is different for each person. And therefore, each consumer has their own individual demand curve. You combine all of the individual demand curves together, and that's what creates that market demand. Okay, so let's take a look at this market demand. So you'll notice here I've got three different graphs set up, and we're going to graph Steve's and Bob's demand, and then we're going to use that to create the market demand. So let's start with Steve. So at $5, Steve won't buy any ice cream cones. Then you'll see here at $3 he'll buy 2. And then at $1 he'll buy 4. So there's our plots, and then there's our line. So that represents Steve's individual demand curve. Now when we go to Bob, we graph his points, notice Bob's is much different. So there's Bob's demand curve. So Steve and Bob have two different demand curves. When we add those together, what we get is market demand down here at the bottom. So when we graph market demand, it's just simply Steve plus Bob at the same price. So here's our points, here's our lines. So Steve's demand, Bob's demand, and then we have the market demand. When the market demand, of course, that's the demand of all consumers in the market. Once you start throwing in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands or millions of individuals, you can see why one individual entering or leaving the market really makes no difference in the market demand. Now, when there's two, obviously there does, but when there's 2 million or 200 million, one or two people leaving the market makes absolutely no difference. It doesn't really matter in the grand scheme because of how many people there are. So our next goal here is to look at the changes in quantity demanded. Now, remember that when prices change, they cause changes in quantity demanded. And that's the key point here, is the only thing, okay, understand that the only thing that can change the quantity demanded is a change in price. That's the law of demand. So it's always an inverse relationship between the two. So changes in price cause movements along the demand curve. So we can put it up over here. So when we plot out and we say, here's a point A, here's another point, here's another point, and we draw the line. So here's our demand curve with 3 points along it. So we're at point A right now. If we move from point A to point B, what happens? So if we see an increase in price from A to B, when that happens, so we see the price goes up, and of course quantity demanded goes down. But notice, of course, that we stay along the curve the entire time. Nothing changes other than the fact that we move from one point to another. So if we take that out, and then we throw in a decrease and look at price C, so what happens when price goes from A to C? Now notice we're talking about a change in price. So when the change in price occurs, it causes cause and effect relationship. So a change in price causes quantity demanded to change. So here we have A. So when the price drops from A to C, quantity demanded increases from point A to C, which would be 4 to 7. So this is the difference. When we talk about a change in quantity demanded, the change in quantity demanded is caused by a change in price. Okay, so we just looked at a change in quantity demanded, which remember can only be caused by price. So now we're going to look at a change in demand, which cannot be caused by price. If you go into your homework or on a quiz or a test and you tell me that one of the things that changes the demand is price, you're going to get it wrong because that's not the case. So let's look at what does cause a change in demand. It's the determinants. So remember those: income, other products, expectations, taste, and size of the market. Those 5 things will cause demand to change but price to remain the same. So let's look at it from a graphing standpoint so we can visualize this. So what we're going to do, we're going to throw up an increase in demand with our demand curve. So we'll call this D0 because that's our original curve. So let's say, for example, that we see an increase in consumer incomes. Well, when consumer incomes increase, it allows us to buy more goods. But do the price of the goods change? Well, the answer is no. So let's look what happens. So when income increases among consumers, demand shifts to the right. We have D1. Okay, so when we see an increase in demand, what we're talking about is a shift to the right of the demand curve. Now I put this line here because you can very clearly tell price never changed. The price was at just over 4.5. It's now, well, yeah, so the price was $4 and our quantity here is just over 4.5, so we'll say 4.6, and it increased to, when we look over here, we can tell, we'll drop the line down, drop the line down, and we'll notice now we see an increase in demand, even though price never changed. The only reason that we see the increase in demand, of course, is because our income's increased. Now, what happens when we have a decrease in demand? Well, the opposite occurs. Demand shifts to the left. We see D2. Notice on D2, price remained the same. The price was the same the entire time, but the demand fell. So if consumer incomes were to fall, what would happen, of course, is demand would shift to the left. So price causes changes in quantity demanded. The determinants of demand cause shifts in demand with prices remaining the same. Very, 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 very important key point. You're going to see this over and over and over again, so make sure you understand that.